In the recent 2012 presidential election, women were a vital voting demographic courted by both candidates. When all the votes were counted, it was revealed that women made up 54% of the electorate in the United States. In the year 1848, which saw the election of Zachary Taylor, women made up exactly 0% of the voting populace. Though conditions were at their most restrictive for the female population of the United States in 1848, this year can be viewed as a catalyst year for America's first-wave feminist movement. So what is feminism? Feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men. This documentary will analyze the collection of movements aimed at defining, establishing, and defending rights for women during the period of United States history known as antebellum America. Beginning in the late 1820s, middle-class women in the North assumed roles that would have been unthinkable to their mothers or grandmothers. Housewives saw themselves as missionaries to their families, and became authorities of fashion and diet, even influencing the moral choices of their children and husbands. Posing as protective mothers, women of antebellum America became public reformers by joining moral reform societies or participating in the temperance or abolitionist movements.
The anti-slavery movement turned many women into advocates of women's rights. Abolitionists called for the absolute human equality and an almost anarchist rejection of prescribed social roles. Many female abolitionists came to the realization that the problems found in slavery issues were applicable to their own plight. In 1838, Angelina Grimke, a major leader in the abolitionist and feminist movements, declared she could not make the contribution she was capable of making toward the emancipation of the slave until and unless she achieved her own emancipation first. By advocating for the rights of others, women were able to justify their own rights.
The parallelism between these two movements emphasizes that this was a time where many social groups were fighting for something they didn't have. The similarities these two movements shared, and their similar lack of and desire for rights, even gave feminists a strong abolitionist support. But most importantly, experience for women in these 19th century reform movements developed their capacities for political involvement and demonstrated to them the need for political equality. Beginning about 1840, women lobbied state legislatures and started fighting for their rights. One of the most prominent leaders of the first-wave feminists was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose work set in motion a convention that marked the true beginning of the women's movement in the United States.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, aside from being literally a bastard, she hungered for education even though no American colleges were admitting women at the time. She enrolled at Emma Willard's Female Seminary, which was in New York, sharing her family's interest in the temperance and anti-slavery movements. It was there she met a young lawyer well known in the community, an anti-slavery advocate, Henry B. Stanton. They wed in 1840, and she even managed to have the word obey omitted from their marriage vows.
The happy couple honeymooned at an anti-slavery convention in London. Men and women were segregated, and the convention's organizers forbade the women to speak. This is where Stanton realized that the logic of anti-slavery applied to women's rights as well, and something needed to change. In 1848, Stanton and Lucretia Mott, a member of both the American Anti-Slavery Society and the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, organized the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York.
I really think that Seneca Falls was the biggest one. It was the most well-known. And the reason that I would say that is because later on in their lives, when sort of asked, to remember what they had done that was important, it was Seneca Falls that they kind of looked back at. It was Seneca Falls that became mythologized. And that was sort of the point that they jumped off from and kind of built from. And sometimes remembered incorrectly and sort of created a memory about that we might not necessarily agree with. But Seneca Falls became larger than life even after the fact.
The first Women's Rights Convention, this vital meeting issued forth an integral document in the path for women's rights, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. Written by Stanton herself, and demanding equality not only on legal and moral arguments, but also on the spirit of Republican institutions, this document deliberately echoed the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
Yes, indeed. The Declaration of Sentiments was a watershed document of the feminist movement. It denounced the, quote, repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, which was pretty bold language for women to be using at the time. Most of these injuries and usurpations were political in nature, as the central issue these feminists wanted to address was the right to vote.
A series of declarations was passed, and the issue of female suffrage met serious opposition until a speech by Frederick Douglass convinced the delegates to pass a declaration demanding it. Citizenship was central to the democratic pattern of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which granted liberty and equality to white men regardless of class, and excluded those who were not white or male.
Indeed, women were facing a lot of opposition in this phase. Female participation in politics was a direct challenge to the women's place ordained by males. A New York legislator, in response to the Declaration of Sentiments, said, "It is well known that the object of these unsexed women is to overthrow the most sacred of our institutions. Are we to put the stamp on the truth upon the libel here set forth, that men and women in the matrimonial relation are to be equal?" Feminist self-assertion really aroused the antagonism of the time's dominant male power.
After the convention, Stanton met Susan B. Anthony, another veteran reformer who became one of Stanton's lifelong collaborators. The educated Stanton wrote the manifestos, and the brave Anthony took them into lecture halls in the state legislature. The two of them and their co-workers won many battles in changing the laws dealing with women's rights to property, the wages of their own labor, and the custody of children in cases of divorce. 14 states passed such legislation, which were even supported by men, fathers who wanted to protect their daughters' rights to the family's property, and these legislative victories culminated in New York's Married Women's Property Act of 1857.
What women were demanding was married women's property rights. It's because, ironically, the dads want to protect their family's property from the crappy son-in-law. But that was it. So it was to keep your property, ironically including slavery, in the family. And your slaves in the family.
However, these women demanding social and political change could do little more than publicize their radical demands for the legal reform of marriage and for complete political equality. The foremost goal of the antebellum feminists still eluded them: suffrage.
Suffrage was by far the most intensely debated topic discussed at Seneca Falls. Stanton fiercely advocated in the 1848 convention, "We now demand our right to vote according to the declaration of the government under which we live." Unfortunately, despite her eloquent support, she was still unable to convince a majority to endorse the resolution.
A question that's often voiced. Many feared a demand for suffrage would negate other more rational demands and would cause the whole feminist movement to look ridiculous. Because the right to vote was possible and potentially achievable, feminists gave up on smaller pleas of equality during this time. This is why, after failing to acquire the right to vote, first-wave feminists had not made many gains as far as political equality.
While they were unable to solve the most pressing issues they aimed to change, these early feminists identified the problems, such as the absence of equitable laws, the lack of equal educational and job opportunities, and of course the right to vote, which were plaguing the women of antebellum America. In doing so, these women played a crucial role in setting the stage and laying the groundwork for the next wave of feminists to come.